June 10, 1944, Villers-Bocage, Normandy. Dawn. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows like wet wool, turning the Norman countryside into a landscape of gray shapes and uncertain distances. The air smelled of crushed grass and diesel fumes, mixed with something sharper, cordite residue from the previous day's skirmishes. In the narrow lanes between ancient stone walls where centuries of French farmers had guided their carts, the war machines of two empires now prowled, their engines rumbling low, predatory. A tiger-eye commander stood in his cupola, scanning the bocage through Zeiss optics that could count the rivets on enemy armor at 1,500 meters. He had every reason to feel invincible. His Panzerkampfwagen 6 carried 88 millimeters of frontal armor, sloped and hardened to resist anything the Allies could throw at it. Behind him, 3 more Tigers idled in echelon, their long-barreled 88mm guns traversing slowly, searching. These were not merely tanks. They were mobile fortresses, the pinnacle of German engineering, the steel embodiment of Blitzkrieg doctrine perfected across 3 years of continental warfare. Somewhere in the fog ahead, American Sherman tanks were advancing. The Germans had encountered them before, in Tunisia, in Sicily, in the grinding Italian campaign. They called them Tommy Cookers, for the way they burned when hit, their gasoline engines igniting like torches, turning their crews to ash in seconds. The Americans built them by the thousands, rolling them off assembly lines in Detroit and Pittsburgh with the same industrial efficiency they had once reserved for automobiles. But quantity, the German tankers believed, could never substitute for quality. A Sherman 75mm gun could barely scratch Tiger armor at combat range. Its frontal protection, a mere 50 millimeters at the thickest point, was a joke to men who had shattered Soviet T-34s and KV-1s on the Eastern Front. The mathematics of armor penetration were brutally simple. Kinetic energy equaled mass times velocity squared. The German 88mm could punch through 150 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. The American 75mm could manage 60 millimeters under ideal conditions. It was not a fight. It was the execution. Yet on this morning, in the fog-shrouded lanes of Normandy, something was different. The British 7th Armored Division, the famed desert rats who had bloodied Rommel in North Africa, were moving through Villers-Bocage with a confidence that seemed misplaced to German observers. Among their columns of standard Shermans rolled a handful of tanks that looked almost identical to their American cousins, differing only in subtle details. A longer barrel, a distinctive muzzle brake, a slightly altered turret profile. These were Sherman Fireflies, British modifications of the American design, mounting a 17-pounder anti-tank gun that could generate muzzle velocities exceeding 2,900 feet per second. The tungsten-cored armor-piercing rounds it fired could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, enough to crack open a Tiger's frontal plate, enough to reach the ammunition stored behind that supposedly impenetrable steel, enough to turn German confidence into burning wreckage. The German tankers did not yet know this. They had been briefed on American weaknesses, not British innovations. They had been told that Allied armor was inferior, that German steel and German gunnery would decide this campaign as they had decided so many others. They settled into their positions with the practiced calm of veterans, waiting for targets to emerge from the morning haze. Behind them, the village of Villers-Bocage lay quiet, its stone houses shuttered, its inhabitants hiding in cellars. The stage was set for a lesson in warfare that would echo across the remaining 11 months of the European conflict. A lesson about adaptation, about the dangers of assumptions, about the moment when technological superiority meets innovative desperation. To understand what happened in those Normandy lanes requires understanding the context of tank warfare in 1944, the competing philosophies that shaped armor doctrine, and the brutal arithmetic of penetration and protection that governed survival on mechanized battlefields. The tank had been born in the First World War as a solution to trench warfare, a mobile bunker to break the stalemate of barbed wire and machine guns. By the Second World War, it had evolved into the decisive weapon of maneuver warfare, the steel fist of Blitzkrieg that had shattered Poland in weeks, France in 40 days, and carved deep into the Soviet Union across thousands of miles. But the tank was also a compromise, a balance of 3 competing factors: firepower, protection, and mobility. Increase one and the others suffered. Thicker armor meant more weight, which meant slower speed and higher fuel consumption. Bigger guns meant larger turrets, heavier components, more complex logistics. The art of tank design lay in finding the optimal balance for a given tactical doctrine. Germany had chosen to prioritize firepower and protection. Their tanks were masterpieces of engineering, over-engineered perhaps with complex transmissions and suspension systems that required specialized parts and skilled mechanics. The Tiger I weighed 54 metric tons, more than twice the weight of a Sherman. Its Maybach engine produced 690 horsepower, but fuel consumption was so high that the tank's operational range barely exceeded 100 kilometers on roads, less than half that cross-country. German doctrine accepted these limitations because German strategy in 1944 was defensive. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing across continents. It was fighting to hold ground, to exact such a terrible price for every kilometer that the Allies would sue for negotiated peace. Heavy tanks suited this mission perfectly. They could anchor defensive positions, dominate key terrain, destroy enemy armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Quality over quantity, elite over mass. It was a philosophy born from German military tradition, from the Prussian General Staff's emphasis on decisive battles and superior tactics. America had made the opposite choice. The Sherman tank was designed not for technological supremacy, but for mass production and strategic mobility. It weighed 30 metric tons, light enough to be transported by the Liberty ships that crossed the Atlantic, light enough to cross the temporary bridges that combat engineers threw across European rivers, light enough to be maintained by mechanics with basic training using standardized parts. Its Wright R975 radial engine was adapted from aircraft, reliable and relatively simple. Its armor was adequate against most German weapons at medium range, though woefully inadequate against the 80mm. But America was not trying to build the best tank. America was trying to build enough tanks to overwhelm German defenders through sheer numbers, to replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, to leverage industrial capacity into military victory. By D-Day, American factories had produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. Germany had built fewer than 1,500 Tigers across the entire war. The mathematics of attrition favored mass production, but numbers alone could not compensate for the psychological impact of technological inferiority. American tank crews landing in Normandy had heard the stories from veterans of North Africa and Italy. Stories of German armor shrugging off 75mm rounds, of Tigers stalking Sherman columns and destroying them one by one from beyond effective return fire range, of crews burning alive because their ammunition ignited from a single penetrating hit. The Sherman's gasoline engine and the ammunition stored in the hull made it exceptionally vulnerable to catastrophic fire. Tankers developed grim humor to cope with terror. They called their Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter advertised as lighting the first time, every time. They called themselves the Expendables. Survival meant tactics, flanking shots at weak side armor, using terrain to close range before the enemy could engage, coordinating with infantry and air support, accepting casualties as the price of eventual numerical superiority. It meant knowing that German tanks were better, but hoping that American production was faster. The British faced the same problem, but with different constraints. Britain's industrial base could not match American output. The empire was exhausted by 5 years of war, its economy devoted entirely to survival, its manpower stretched thin across global commitments. British tank production focused on the Cromwell and Churchill models, but both had limitations. The Cromwell was fast but undergunned and thinly armored. The Churchill was heavily armored but slow and mechanically unreliable. By 1943, British armor commanders in the Mediterranean were desperate for a tank that could match German heavies on equal terms. The solution came not from designing a new vehicle, but from adapting an existing one. British engineers took the American Sherman and replaced its 75mm gun with the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a weapon that had proven devastatingly effective in the towed artillery role. The modification required extensive turret redesign. The 17-pounder was physically larger and longer than the 75mm, with significantly greater recoil forces. The turret had to be rebalanced, the recoil mechanism redesigned, the ammunition storage reconfigured. Only one tank in every troop of 4 Shermans could be converted, because 17-pounder production was limited. But the result was a vehicle that could kill tigers and panthers at ranges where they expected immunity. The Firefly looked almost identical to a standard Sherman from most angles, differing primarily in the length of its gun barrel and the presence of a distinctive muzzle brake to manage recoil. This visual similarity was both a weakness and a strength. German tank commanders had learned to prioritize Fireflies as threats, trying to identify and destroy them first in any engagement. But in the confusion of combat, especially in the close terrain of Normandy's Bocage, that identification was not always possible. Firefly crews learned to camouflage their distinctive barrels, to position themselves behind standard Shermans, to hold fire until the critical moment when surprise mattered more than sustained firepower. They became the hidden daggers in the Allied armored fist, numerically rare but tactically decisive. The German tankers advancing through Normandy in June 1944 knew that the Allies had landed, with massive numerical superiority. They knew that American production was a tidal wave that would eventually drown the Wehrmacht in steel and explosives. But they also knew that German tanks were superior. The Tigers and Panthers that equipped elite units. The combat experience accumulated across years of warfare. The tactical doctrine refined through victories and defeats on two fronts. When they saw Sherman silhouettes through their optics, they expected what they had always seen. Inferior tanks manned by inexperienced crews. Targets to be destroyed methodically before they could close to effective range. The concept that a Sherman might be truly dangerous at 1,000 yards. That it might penetrate tiger armor with a single shot. That it might turn predator into prey. This concept existed outside their operational framework. Intelligence briefings had mentioned British gun modifications, but intelligence briefings mentioned many things, and the evidence of their own experience weighed more heavily than theoretical warnings. The engagement at Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, became legend precisely because it shattered these assumptions so dramatically. The British 7th Armored Division pushed into the town, hoping to exploit a gap in German lines, to swing around the German defenses anchoring at Caen, to reach open country where superior numbers and air support could decide the campaign. Instead, they encountered SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, one of Germany's most decorated tank aces, commanding a single Tiger I from Heavy SS Tank Battalion 101. What followed was one of the most lopsided armor engagements of the Western Front. Wittmann's Tiger destroyed more than a dozen British tanks and armored vehicles in 15 minutes, ambushing the column in the narrow streets where maneuver was impossible, and escape meant reversing into the vehicles behind. British Shermans fired at point-blank range, their 75mm rounds bouncing off Tiger armor, or fragmenting against its surface hardening. Wittmann's Tiger advanced through the column like a thresher through wheat, firing, reversing, repositioning, firing again. The British tankers fought with desperate courage, but courage could not compensate for the physics of armor penetration. By the time Wittmann withdrew, the road through Villers-Bocage was a graveyard of burning vehicles. But the story did not end with German victory. Later that same day, British forces regrouped and counterattacked. This time, Fireflies were positioned in overwatch, their 17-pounders covering the approaches. When Tigers emerged from concealment to engage what appeared to be standard Shermans, the Fireflies opened fire from hull-down positions at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The tungsten-cored rounds struck with velocities high enough to defeat even sloped armor. Tigers that had seemed invincible that morning brewed up just as Shermans did, ammunition igniting, turrets blown off their rings by internal explosions, crew members scrambling from hatches trailing flames. Wittmann himself was forced to abandon his damaged Tiger and withdraw on foot. The legend of invincibility cracked. German after-action reports began noting with alarm that some Allied tanks possessed unexpectedly powerful guns, that frontal armor could no longer be trusted at long range, that the tactical calculus of armor combat had shifted. This shift rippled across the Normandy campaign. In the Bocage, the patchwork of small fields divided by thick hedgerows and sunken lanes, tank warfare became a brutal game of ambush and counter-ambush. The terrain negated German advantages in long-range gunnery. Engagements happened at 200 meters or less, often at point-blank range when vehicles rounded blind corners. Standard Shermans still burned. Their crews still died in horrible numbers. But Fireflies provided a degree of deterrence that changed German tactical behavior. Tiger and Panther commanders could no longer advance aggressively, knowing that any Sherman formation might include a Firefly with a shot that could kill them instantly. They became more cautious, more defensive, ceding the initiative to Allied forces. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical one. German armor superiority, which had been an article of faith since 1940, was no longer absolute. The numbers tell part of the story. In the Normandy campaign from June to August 1944, German armored forces destroyed thousands of Allied tanks, Shermans, Cromwells, Churchills, inflicting kill ratios that sometimes reached 5 or 6 to 1 in their favor. But they could not replace their losses. Every Tiger destroyed represented months of production effort, specialized components that could not be substituted, trained crews that could not be easily replaced. The Allies lost more tanks but landed more tanks. American depots in Normandy stocked thousands of replacement Shermans. Crews killed in action were replaced with fresh crews from training units in England. The industrial and logistical systems that kept Allied armor operational were immune to tactical defeat. They existed across the Channel, beyond the reach of German counterattack, fed by factories in Detroit and Birmingham that Germans could not bomb effectively. Meanwhile, German tank production was collapsing under strategic bombing. Fuel supplies were dwindling as Romania's oil fields fell to the Soviets, and the training programs that had once produced elite panzer crews were abbreviated to weeks because the front demanded replacements. Immediately, the Firefly represented something more than just a technical solution to a tactical problem. It represented the Allies' fundamental strategic advantage, the ability to adapt, to innovate within existing systems, to improve incrementally while maintaining mass production. Germany's tanks were technological marvels, but they were also evolutionary dead ends, so complex, so resource-intensive, so dependent on intact supply chains that they could not be sustained once the Reich's industrial base began to crumble. The Sherman, by contrast, was a platform that could be modified and improved. The Firefly was one such modification. Later variants mounted 76mm high-velocity guns, added wet ammunition storage to reduce fire risk, improved armor in critical areas. None of these improvements made the Sherman the equal of a Tiger in isolation, but they narrowed the gap enough that numerical superiority and tactical coordination could compensate. The Allies did not need the best tank. They needed good enough tanks in overwhelming numbers, supported by air superiority, supplied by logistics networks that could deliver fuel and ammunition faster than enemy action consumed it. German tankers in Normandy experienced this reality as a slow, grinding defeat. They won individual engagements and lost the campaign. They destroyed more tanks than they lost and retreated anyway. They fought with skill and courage and watched the front collapse around them not because of tactical failure, but because the strategic context made tactical victory irrelevant. After the war, many German veterans wrote memoirs emphasizing their technical superiority, the quality of their equipment, the individual heroism of crews who fought against impossible odds. These accounts were not wrong. German tanks were superior on a one-to-one basis, and German crews often displayed extraordinary professionalism under horrific conditions. But they also reflected a kind of cognitive dissonance, an inability to accept that the war was lost not on the tactical level, but on the strategic one, that having the best tanks did not matter when the enemy could afford to lose 5 tanks for every one you destroyed and still advance. The symbolic object that recurs through this narrative is the armor-piercing round itself, specifically the 17-pounder's tungsten-cored projectile that made the Firefly lethal to German heavies. Tungsten is a metal with one of the highest melting points of any element, nearly 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and a density almost twice that of steel. These properties make it ideal for penetrating armor. The high density provides kinetic energy. The hardness resists deformation on impact. The heat resistance allows it to punch through hardened steel without shattering. Tungsten was strategically rare, mined in limited quantities and subject to complex refining processes. Germany had access to tungsten deposits in occupied territories, but Allied bombing and partisan activity disrupted supply chains. Britain and America could import tungsten from neutral countries like Portugal and from mines in the western United States, maintaining production of tungsten-cored ammunition even as demand skyrocketed. This tungsten core, no larger than a man's fist, represented the concentration of industrial power, the mining operations to extract ore from deep rock, the chemical processes to refine it to metallic purity, the precision manufacturing to machine it to exact tolerances, the logistics networks to deliver it from mine to factory to depot to battlefield. When a Firefly crew loaded a 17-pounder round, they were loading not just a projectile, but the accumulated capability of an industrial system that could transform raw materials into military effect across thousands of miles and multiple continents. The German Tiger they engaged represented a similar accumulation of industrial effort, but one that was more fragile, more dependent on intact supply lines and specialized components. The tungsten round versus the Tigers. Armor was industrial democracy versus industrial autocracy, mass production and global trade versus centralized planning and limited resources. The Germans had their own tungsten-cored ammunition, Panzer Granit 40, which improved the penetration of their already formidable guns. But by 1944, tungsten shortages forced increasing reliance on conventional steel rounds and shaped charge weapons. The Allies, by contrast, were ramping up tungsten ammunition production, prioritizing it for weapons like the 17-pounder where it made the most difference. This disparity was another manifestation of strategic imbalance. The Allies could afford to use rare materials for specialized applications while maintaining overall production volumes. Germany had to choose between quality and quantity, and increasingly chose the former at the expense of the latter. The result was technically superior weapons in insufficient numbers, maintained by armies that were running out of fuel, ammunition, and replacement crews. When a 17-pounder round struck Tiger armor at 1,000 yards, the impact generated temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit at the point of contact, enough to turn steel molten and blow it inward as a jet of superheated metal and gas. This jet, traveling at hypersonic velocities, penetrated the armor and entered the fighting compartment, where it ignited ammunition, hydraulic fluid, stored fuel, anything flammable. The explosion that followed was not merely destruction but annihilation. Turrets torn from hulls, armor plate blown outward in jagged fragments, crew members killed instantly by overpressure or incinerated by the fireball. German tankers who survived such hits often described a moment of incomprehension, the assumption that their armor would protect them, the shock when it did not, the split-second realization that the rules of engagement had changed. Many did not survive long enough to process that realization. The tungsten round transformed Invincible Fortress into Death Trap in the time it took sound to travel from gun muzzle to target. The transformation in German perception was not instantaneous, but cumulative, built through repeated encounters where the expected did not occur, where American toy Shermans revealed themselves as lethal threats. After Villers-Bocage, similar engagements played out across Normandy. At Goodwood in July, British armor, including Fireflies, engaged German defenders around Caen. The attack failed strategically, but German commanders noted with concern the increasing effectiveness of Allied anti-tank capabilities. At Falaise in August, as the German 7th Army attempted to escape encirclement, Fireflies among the Allied forces blocking the gap destroyed dozens of German tanks trying to break through. The statistical kill ratio still favored Germany, but the absolute numbers favored the Allies. More German tanks destroyed than could be replaced, more experienced crews lost than training programs could provide, more territory conceded than defensive lines could hold. German tactical doctrine began to shift in response. Tank commanders were instructed to avoid frontal engagements at long range, to use terrain and cover more aggressively, to coordinate more closely with anti-tank guns and infantry, to create overlapping fields of fire. Panthers, originally designed as offensive breakthrough weapons, were increasingly employed in defensive ambush positions. Tigers were husbanded as mobile reserves rather than committed to sustained combat. These adjustments acknowledged implicitly that German armor no longer dominated the battlefield, that tactical caution was necessary to preserve dwindling resources, that losses had to be minimized because they could not be replaced. The Wehrmacht's armored forces were transitioning from sword to shield, from instrument of blitzkrieg to desperate backstop against Allied advance. The psychological impact on German tankers was profound and complex. On one level, they maintained professional pride in their equipment and training, the conviction that they were individually superior to their opponents. After-action reports and personal accounts emphasized successful engagements, moments when German gunnery and tactics prevailed against numerical odds. But beneath this professional confidence ran a current of fatalism, the recognition that individual victories did not alter the strategic trajectory, that the war was being lost through attrition rather than decided through decisive battle. Diaries and letters from the period reflect this tension. Pride in the Tiger's capabilities alongside despair at the endless waves of Allied armor, admiration for the 88mm killing power alongside, awareness that ammunition was rationed and fuel was scarce. The experience of encountering a Firefly was particularly demoralizing because it violated the assumptions that made Tiger deployment psychologically sustainable. German doctrine accepted that Tigers would be outnumbered, that they would face multiple opponents simultaneously, that tactical skill and technological superiority would compensate for numerical disadvantage. But this doctrine assumed that German guns could destroy Allied tanks faster than Allied guns could destroy Tigers, that frontal armor would protect crews while they methodically eliminated threats. The Firefly broke this equation. A single Firefly among a troop of Shermans could kill a Tiger before the Tiger identified which tank was the threat. German crews found themselves in the position American crews had occupied months earlier, hoping to spot the dangerous enemy first, hoping to land the killing shot before taking one, hoping that luck and skill would suffice when equipment parity had been lost. This reversal of roles did not equalize the battlefield. German armor remained superior in most engagements, but it introduced uncertainty into situations where Germans had expected dominance. Uncertainty is corrosive to morale. Soldiers can endure terrible conditions and high casualties if they believe their efforts contribute to eventual victory, if they trust their equipment and leadership, if they see a path from present suffering to future success. But when that belief erodes, when the trajectory is clearly toward defeat regardless of individual performance, morale collapses. German tankers in late 1944 fought with extraordinary tenacity, inflicting disproportionate casualties on Allied forces. But their journals and memoirs reveal an increasing sense of futility, the recognition that they were fighting not to win, but to delay the inevitable, that their sacrifices were buying time for a regime that had no plan for victory. The Firefly's impact extended beyond individual engagements to influence Allied operational planning. The availability of tanks that could reliably penetrate German heavy armor allowed British commanders to be more aggressive in armor employment, to accept engagements that would have been prohibitively costly with standard Shermans alone. The presence of Fireflies in every troop provided organic anti-tank capability that reduced dependence on towed anti-tank guns, which were less mobile and more vulnerable to German artillery. This increased tactical flexibility. Armor units could operate more independently, respond more quickly to opportunities, sustain momentum through enemy defensive lines. The Firefly was not the only factor enabling Allied success in Normandy, but it was a significant one, removing a critical constraint on operational tempo. American forces, meanwhile, began receiving improved Shermans mounting 76mm guns, which offered better penetration than the original 75mm, though still inferior to the 17-pounder. The American approach differed from the British modification. Rather than creating specialist variants within existing units, American doctrine distributed the improved guns more widely, increasing the overall lethality of armored formations. By the late summer of 1944, German tankers could no longer assume that any given Sherman was harmless at long range. Even standard models might carry guns capable of defeating medium armor, and identifying threats required caution that slowed reaction times and ceded initiative. The Allied learning curve was steep but decisive, from the disasters of early Normandy, where inexperienced crews died in large numbers, to the autumn campaigns where American and British armor operated with confidence born of experience and improved equipment. The German response to this shift was hampered by industrial and logistical constraints that were spiraling beyond control. Production of heavy tanks could not match losses even when factories operated at maximum capacity, and strategic bombing was reducing that capacity month by month. The Maybach factories that built Tiger engines were targeted repeatedly. The Henschel works that assembled Tiger chassis suffered disruption from air raids and raw material shortages. Fuel supplies dwindled as Allied forces overran German-occupied France, and Soviet forces advanced toward the Romanian oil fields that supplied much of Germany's petroleum. By autumn 1944, German armor units were increasingly immobile not from battlefield damage but from lack of fuel. Tigers abandoned by roadsides because their tanks were empty. Panthers destroyed by their own crews because they could not be driven to safety. The technological superiority that had defined German armor in 1940 was irrelevant without the industrial base to sustain it. The strategic lesson was harsh and unambiguous. Quality without quantity is insufficient in industrial warfare. Germany had gambled on technological edge compensating for numerical inferiority, on tactical brilliance overcoming material imbalance, on the superior will and skill of German soldiers deciding campaigns against enemies who enjoyed massive advantages in production and resources. This gamble had worked in Poland and France, where campaigns were brief and German industry could replenish losses before the next offensive. It had nearly worked in the Soviet Union, where initial victories destroyed much of the Red Army and seized vast territories. But by 1944, the gamble had failed. The enemies Germany faced, the Soviet Union with its inexhaustible reserves of men and material, Britain with its global empire and industrial capacity, America with its unmatched production capability, could absorb losses and continue fighting, could learn from defeats and adapt, could overwhelm quality with quantity sustained over years of attritional struggle. The Tiger and the Panther were magnificent machines. But magnificence could not alter the strategic balance when the other side could build 10 Shermans for every German heavy tank. When Allied air forces controlled the skies and interdicted supply lines. When partisan resistance sabotaged railroads and factories across occupied Europe. The final phase of the Normandy campaign, the breakout from the beachhead in late July and August, demonstrated these dynamics with brutal clarity. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Cotentin Peninsula, succeeded not through superior armor but through concentrated air power and artillery preparation that shattered German defensive lines, followed by rapid exploitation that prevented the Wehrmacht from establishing new positions. German armor attempted to counterattack at Mortain, throwing together scratch forces of Tigers, Panthers, and assault guns in a desperate effort to cut the American corridor and restore a coherent front. The counterattack failed catastrophically. Allied air forces destroyed German armor formations in daylight attacks. Fireflies and improved Shermans engaged surviving tanks at medium range, and the numerical imbalance was so extreme that German forces were simply overwhelmed. The Falaise pocket, where the remnants of the German 7th Army attempted to escape encirclement, became a killing ground where Allied armor and artillery destroyed thousands of vehicles and killed or captured tens of thousands of soldiers. German tank aces who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front died in Normandy, their Tigers and Panthers reduced to burning hulks by enemies they had once dismissed as inferior. The German survivors who escaped Falaise retreated across France in disarray, abandoning equipment they could not fuel, fighting rearguard actions to delay pursuit but unable to halt it. By September, Allied forces were approaching the German border, having advanced farther in 3 months than they had expected to achieve in 6. The Wehrmacht's armored forces, which had numbered hundreds of tanks in Normandy, were reduced to scattered remnants, individual tanks attached to infantry divisions, ad hoc formations cobbled together from training units, battalions existing on paper but fielding only a handful of operational vehicles. The material and psychological dominance that German armor had enjoyed in 1940 was gone, eroded by attrition and industrial imbalance, by tactical adaptation and technological parity, by the simple reality that no amount of individual excellence could compensate for strategic overextension. For German tankers, the experience of Normandy was a descent from confidence into despair. They had begun the campaign believing in their equipment and their cause, trusting that German engineering and German fighting spirit would decide the battle. They ended it as survivors of a catastrophic defeat, having watched superior tanks destroyed by enemies they had underestimated, having seen friends burn in vehicles that were supposed to be invincible, having learned that technological superiority meant nothing when the enemy could afford to lose 5 tanks for everyone you killed, and still advance. The laughter they had directed at American toys in the spring of 1944 died in the summer, replaced by grim professionalism and then by fatalism and finally by the numb, endurance of men who knew they were fighting for a lost cause. The American and British tankers who faced them underwent their own transformation. They had landed in Normandy with trepidation, knowing their tanks were inferior, expecting to die in large numbers for every mile gained. Many did die. Sherman crews suffered casualty rates exceeding 50% in some units, burning alive in tanks that were mobile coffins against German armor. But the survivors adapted, learning to use terrain and tactics to compensate for equipment deficiencies, coordinating with infantry and air support, developing techniques to flank and overwhelm German heavies through numerical advantage. The arrival of Fireflies and improved Shermans bolstered their confidence, providing a degree of deterrence that changed the psychological dynamic. By the end of the campaign, Allied tankers had learned that German armor could be defeated. The Tigers and Panthers were formidable but not invincible, that courage and skill and overwhelming numbers could overcome technological disadvantage. This confidence carried into the autumn campaigns, into the drive across France and the grinding battles in the Hürtgen Forest and the Ardennes, into the final push into Germany itself. The epilogue to this story is written in the fields of Normandy, where rusting tank hulls still emerge from the soil during plowing season, silent monuments to the men who fought and died in them. The hedgerows where Fireflies ambushed Tigers are placid now, marked by small memorials and overgrown with brambles. The villages where armor clashed, Villers-Bocage, Caen, Falaise, have been rebuilt, their scars filled in, their streets returned to civilian traffic. But the lesson of those battles endures, carved into the history of industrial warfare and the strategic calculus of nations. The lesson is not that American tanks were better than German tanks. They were not. The Sherman, even with modifications, remained inferior to the Tiger and Panther in most measurable parameters. But superiority on the battlefield is not determined solely by technical specifications or individual combat performance. It is determined by the interaction of technology, tactics, logistics, production, and strategic context. The Allies did not win in Normandy because they built better tanks. They won because they built enough tanks, because they could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, because they adapted their equipment to narrow performance gaps, because they leveraged industrial capacity into military power in ways that Germany, with its fractured economy and disrupted supply chains, could not match. The Firefly represents this lesson in miniature, a modification rather than a revolution, an incremental improvement that addressed a critical deficiency without requiring wholesale redesign or retooling. It was not the optimal solution to the Tiger problem, but it was a good enough solution that could be fielded quickly and in sufficient numbers to matter tactically. This pragmatism, this willingness to accept imperfect solutions that could be implemented immediately, rather than waiting for perfect solutions that might never arrive, characterized Allied strategic culture. Germany, by contrast, pursued excellence. The Tiger II with even heavier armor and a longer gun, the Panther II with improved transmission, paper projects for super-heavy tanks that would have been unstoppable if they had ever left the drawing board. These pursuits of perfection consumed resources and engineering talent that might have been better spent on simpler, more producible designs. They reflected a strategic culture that valued quality over quantity, that believed technical superiority could compensate for material inferiority, that could not accept the brutal logic of attritional warfare. The tungsten round that pierced Tiger armor at 1,000 yards symbolizes more than armor penetration. It symbolizes the reach of democratic industrial power, the ability to mobilize resources across continents, to coordinate production across allied nations, to deliver refined rare metals from American mines and Portuguese suppliers, to British factories and finally to Norman battlefields, where they decided the fates of empires. It symbolizes the strategic depth that autocracy cannot match, the resilience of systems distributed across multiple nations and continents, the power of alliances that pool resources and coordinate efforts toward common objectives. When that round struck Tiger armor, it carried with it the accumulated industrial and logistical might of nations that had transformed their economies for total war, that could afford to expend rare materials on single shots because they could produce those shots by the hundreds of thousands. The German tankers who died in Normandy were not inferior soldiers. Many were veterans of brutal campaigns, skilled professionals who had survived years of combat against determined enemies. They fought with courage and competence, often against overwhelming odds, and they inflicted terrible casualties on their opponents. Their defeat was not a personal failure but a strategic inevitability, the result of decisions made years earlier in Berlin and Moscow and Washington, decisions about production priorities and alliance structures, and war aims that constrained tactical options and determined operational outcomes. They laughed at American toys because they had been told, and had learned through experience, that German steel was superior. They stopped laughing when British tungsten, fired from modified American tanks, turned their steel fortresses into tombs. The larger truth this experience reveals is that in modern warfare, technological advantage is transient and contextual. What matters is not whether your weapon is superior in isolation, but whether your entire system, production, logistics, training, tactics, strategic depth, can sustain that advantage across extended campaigns and adapt when the enemy innovates. The Firefly was not individually superior to the Tiger, but the system that produced and deployed the Firefly, British, engineering adapting American, production with materials sourced from global trade, was more resilient and more sustainable than the system that produced the Tiger. Germany built better tanks. The Allies built better systems. In the end, systems prevail over individual excellence, because wars are not decided by single engagements but by the accumulation of logistical tonnage, replacement crews, fuel deliveries, ammunition stocks, industrial output, and strategic coordination across years of grinding conflict. The Sherman, dismissed as a toy by enemies who measured superiority in armor thickness and gun caliber, survived the war and served in armies around the world for decades. The Tiger, marvel of German engineering, vanished from battlefields by 1945. Its last specimens destroyed or abandoned. Its production lines bombed into rubble. Its legacy reduced to museum pieces and the odd recollections of men who faced it in combat. Superiority, it turns out, is measured not in technical specifications, but in strategic outcomes. Not in the quality of individual weapons, but in the ability to field, sustain, and adapt those weapons across the full span of industrial conflict. The Firefly taught that lesson to German tankers in the summer of 1944, one tungsten round at a time, piercing not just armor, but the illusion that quality alone could decide modern war.